The people who walk into your life at the exact moment everything falls apart are rarely the ones you expected to find. On a warm Saturday afternoon in Charleston, South Carolina, sunlight poured through the stained glass windows of St. Andrew's Chapel, casting gentle colors across polished wooden pews filled with smiling relatives, lifelong friends, and guests dressed for what everyone believed would become the happiest day of Emily Harper's life. Soft music echoed through the historic church, while fresh white flowers lined the aisle and cameras waited to capture a celebration that had been planned for nearly a year. Emily stood at the front of the sanctuary wearing the wedding dress she had imagined since childhood, her bouquet trembling almost imperceptibly in her hands as she watched the entrance where her groom was supposed to appear. At first, the delay felt ordinary. Weddings rarely followed a perfect schedule. The guests whispered to one another with patient smiles, assuming traffic or a simple misunderstanding had caused the brief interruption. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The musicians quietly repeated the same melody while the wedding planner checked her phone again and again, forcing calm into every reassuring smile she offered. Emily's father shifted uneasily near the front row, while her closest friends exchanged uncertain glances they tried desperately to hide. Soon the whispers grew louder than the music itself. Phones appeared beneath pews as guests searched for updates that never arrived. The empty doorway at the back of the chapel somehow became impossible to ignore. Emily remained standing exactly where she was, refusing to let panic reach her face, although every passing minute made the silence heavier than the one before it. Across the street, Marcus Carter had just finished helping his young daughter choose a birthday card for her kindergarten teacher before stopping at a neighborhood bakery to pick up cupcakes for the small family celebration they planned later that evening. His daughter skipped happily beside him, completely unaware that only a few steps away another person's world was quietly collapsing. As they walked toward their pickup truck parked beside the church, they noticed guests slowly leaving the building much earlier than anyone expected. Some looked uncomfortable. Others avoided eye contact entirely. A few spoke in hushed voices filled with sympathy and disbelief. Marcus instinctively slowed his pace. He had learned through years of raising his daughter alone that moments of public embarrassment often became far more painful because everyone else chose to watch instead of help. He lifted his daughter into the truck first before glancing back toward the chapel entrance one final time. The large wooden doors slowly opened, and Emily stepped outside alone. The joyful music had stopped. Her bouquet remained in her hands, but the excitement that had filled her eyes only minutes earlier had disappeared beneath quiet disbelief. Guests passed around her without knowing what to say. Some offered awkward hugs before leaving. Others simply lowered their eyes and hurried toward the parking lot. Emily stood completely still at the top of the church steps, as if her heart had not yet accepted what reality had already decided. Marcus recognized that expression immediately. It was the look of someone trying to remain strong because breaking down in front of strangers felt even harder than the loss itself. His daughter looked toward Emily with innocent concern before softly asking why the bride looked so lonely. Marcus did not answer right away. Instead, he quietly closed the truck door, took one slow breath, and walked back toward the church, becoming the only person moving in the opposite direction as everyone else continued walking away. Marcus stopped several feet below the church entrance, close enough to show that he had returned, but far enough to respect the invisible space around Emily. The afternoon sun rested softly against the chapel's white stone walls, yet the warmth seemed unable to reach the bride standing alone at the top of the steps. Her bouquet had begun to tilt in her hands. A few white petals had already fallen onto the pavement, unnoticed among the shadows of departing guests. Olivia stood beside the truck, watching her father with the quiet patience she had learned from years of seeing him help people without asking whether they deserved it first. Emily finally lifted her eyes. She looked at Marcus as though trying to understand why a stranger was walking toward the pain everyone else had chosen to escape. He did not offer a dramatic expression. He did not rush toward her with questions. He simply stopped and waited until she seemed ready to acknowledge him. "I do not know what happened today," he said quietly, "but you should not have to face it alone." The words were simple. That made them harder to dismiss. Emily's lips parted, but no answer came. For nearly an hour, people had surrounded her with apologies, explanations, and uncomfortable promises that everything would eventually make sense. None of them had stayed long enough to let silence be part of the conversation. Marcus did. He stood with both hands relaxed at his sides, his posture calm, his attention steady without becoming intrusive. Emily glanced toward the parking lot, where the last luxury sedan disappeared beyond the oak trees lining the street. "Everyone keeps telling me I will be all right," she said at last. Her voice was soft, but there was no weakness in it, only exhaustion. "They say it like they need me to believe them before they leave." Marcus looked toward the empty chapel doors behind her. "Sometimes people say the right thing because they do not know how to do the harder thing." Emily studied him. "And what is the harder thing?" "Staying," he answered. The single word settled between them. A breeze moved through the flower arrangements along the steps, carrying the faint scent of roses and fresh-cut greenery into the street. Emily lowered her gaze toward the bouquet, as though seeing it for the first time since the ceremony had collapsed. "You do not even know me." Marcus nodded. "That is true." His honesty surprised her. He did not try to turn kindness into familiarity. "Then why did you come back?" she asked. Before Marcus could answer, Olivia opened the truck door and stepped carefully onto the sidewalk. She held one of the bakery boxes against her chest, watching her father for permission. Marcus gave a small nod. The little girl walked toward them with measured steps, suddenly aware that the woman in the wedding dress was carrying a sadness much larger than she understood. When she reached the bottom stair, she looked up at Emily and held out the box with both hands. "We have cupcakes," Olivia said. "Daddy says everyone deserves something sweet when they are sad." Emily stared at the child, then at Marcus. Something shifted in her expression. Not happiness. Not yet. Just the first small crack in the wall she had built to survive the last hour. She accepted the box carefully, as though the kindness inside it might break if she moved too quickly. "Thank you," she whispered. Olivia smiled. "You are welcome." Marcus watched Emily hold the cupcake box beside the bouquet that had once symbolized a future she thought was certain. One had been planned for a year. The other had been offered by a child who expected nothing. And standing there between the empty church and the waiting truck, Emily felt the strange weight of realizing that the smallest gesture of the day had become the only one that felt real. Emily held the small bakery box against her bouquet without opening it. Somehow it felt wrong to disturb a gift that had been offered with such innocent sincerity. For several quiet seconds, none of them spoke. The silence was no longer uncomfortable. It simply gave everyone permission to breathe again. A light breeze carried a few loose flower petals across the church steps before disappearing down the nearly empty street. Volunteers quietly removed folding chairs from the chapel lawn while the florist gathered arrangements that had been prepared for a celebration that never happened. The entire afternoon seemed caught between what had been planned and what reality had chosen instead. Emily looked down at the cupcake box and let out a small, unsteady laugh that surprised even herself. "This is probably the first wedding gift I have received today that was given without expectations," she said softly. Marcus smiled, though only slightly. Children are good at reminding adults what generosity is supposed to look like. Olivia nodded proudly, unaware that her simple gesture had become far more important than she realized. Emily carefully lifted the lid just enough to see the cupcake inside. Bright blue frosting swirled across the top, with tiny white sugar stars scattered around the edge. It was imperfect. One side had leaned slightly during the drive. Somehow that made it feel even more genuine. She looked toward Olivia again. "Did you choose this one?" Olivia nodded enthusiastically. It looked the happiest. Emily could not help smiling, though the expression remained fragile, almost unfamiliar after everything that had happened. "I think you were right." Marcus noticed the faint change in her face, but wisely chose not to mention it. Some moments became stronger when nobody tried to define them. Emily closed the box again and held it carefully against her chest. "I spent almost a year planning today," she admitted after another long silence. "Every flower, every song, every table setting. I wanted everything to be perfect." Her voice became quieter. "I never imagined perfection could disappear in less than 5 minutes." Marcus looked toward the open church doors before answering. "Plans can disappear very quickly." Emily studied him. "You say that like you already know." Marcus lowered his eyes briefly. "Life has a way of teaching everyone eventually." He offered nothing more. Emily sensed there was another story hidden behind those words, but she respected the fact that he was not ready to tell it. She appreciated that restraint. Too many people filled silence with details that belonged to them instead of listening to the person standing in front of them. Marcus never seemed to do that. Nearby, one of the church employees accidentally dropped a stack of folded programs onto the sidewalk. Without hesitation, Marcus walked over, knelt beside the scattered papers, and quietly helped gather every last one before returning. He did not announce what he had done. He did not wait for thanks. Emily watched the brief exchange with thoughtful eyes. "You notice everything," she said. Marcus shrugged gently. Small things become easier to carry when someone helps before they become big things. Emily looked around the nearly empty church grounds. Earlier that afternoon, hundreds of people had filled every seat inside the sanctuary. Expensive cars had lined the street. Cameras had flashed. Laughter had echoed through the courtyard. Now only a handful of workers remained, silently erasing every visible sign that a wedding had ever been planned. The speed of it all felt almost unreal. "It is strange," she whispered. "A place can be full of people 1 hour and feel completely empty the next." Marcus followed her gaze across the quiet property. Sometimes empty places become where new beginnings find enough room to arrive. Emily slowly looked back at him. For the first time since the ceremony collapsed, she stopped wondering why this stranger had stayed behind. Instead, she found herself wondering what kind of life had taught a man to carry so much peace without ever asking the world to notice. Emily followed Marcus with her eyes as he quietly returned from helping the church employee collect the scattered programs. The man thanked him with a grateful smile before disappearing back inside the sanctuary. Marcus simply nodded and walked back as though nothing unusual had happened. Emily noticed something that had escaped her throughout the day. He never performed kindness. He simply practiced it. There was a difference, and somehow that difference made every small gesture feel genuine. She looked down at the bakery box still resting against her bouquet. "You help people like it is a habit," she said softly. Marcus smiled with quiet honesty. "After a while, it becomes one." Emily tilted her head slightly. "Most people are kind when life is going well. You seem kind even when nobody is watching." Marcus glanced toward Olivia, who had wandered only a few feet away to watch a butterfly settle on one of the flower arrangements that would soon be taken away. "My daughter is always watching," he answered, "even when she looks like she is paying attention to something else." Emily followed his eyes and watched Olivia carefully avoid stepping on the fallen flower petals scattered across the stone walkway. The little girl gently picked up a ribbon that had blown loose from one of the decorations and handed it to a volunteer with a bright smile before returning to admire the butterfly again. Emily could not help noticing how naturally compassion seemed to pass from father to daughter, not through lessons spoken aloud, but through countless ordinary moments repeated over many years. "She reminds me of you," Emily said. Marcus gave a quiet laugh. "I hope she grows into someone much better." Emily shook her head gently. "If she does, she already has an incredible beginning." Those words lingered between them. For the first time since they met, Emily saw Marcus lower his eyes, almost embarrassed by the compliment. It was obvious he accepted praise less comfortably than responsibility. That realization made her smile again, this time a little more naturally. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said after another pause. Marcus nodded. "You can ask." Emily hesitated before speaking. "Has anyone ever stayed with you on your worst day?" Marcus looked across the quiet church parking lot where the last members of the cleaning crew loaded folding tables into a truck. His answer did not come immediately. When it finally did, his voice was calm, almost reflective. "Yes." Emily waited without interrupting. "Years ago, after my wife passed away, I spent a long time believing I had to carry every burden alone. Most people wanted to help, but they did not know how. Then one afternoon an older neighbor sat beside me on my front porch for almost an hour. He hardly spoke at all." Marcus smiled faintly at the memory. When he finally stood up to leave, he only said one sentence. Emily listened carefully. "What did he say?" Marcus looked directly at her. "You survived today. Tomorrow deserves the same chance." Emily felt something tighten gently inside her chest. The words were simple, yet they reached the place where all the encouragement she had heard earlier had failed. She slowly looked back at the empty church doors. The future she had imagined that morning no longer existed. But tomorrow still would. Olivia suddenly skipped back toward them, holding a tiny white feather she had found beside the chapel steps. "Look what I found," she said excitedly. Marcus smiled. That is beautiful. Olivia held it toward Emily. You can keep it if you want. Maybe it will help you remember today was not all sad. Emily carefully accepted the feather, placing it inside the bakery box beside the cupcake before closing the lid once again. She looked at Marcus with quiet gratitude. I think I am going to remember today differently than I expected. Marcus nodded gently. Sometimes the story that saves us is not the one we plan to live. It is the one kindness quietly writes when everything else falls apart. Emily carefully closed the bakery box again, making sure the small white feather rested safely beside the cupcake before holding it against her bouquet. It was such an ordinary collection of things. A dessert from a little girl. A feather carried by the afternoon breeze. Flowers prepared for a ceremony that had never reached its vows. Yet somehow they felt more valuable than the expensive gifts waiting unopened inside the church reception hall. For the first time all day, Emily realized that the things people remembered were rarely the things that cost the most. They were the moments that quietly reminded them they were not alone. She looked toward Marcus, who had never once tried to fix her sadness or explain away her disappointment. He had simply remained present. That simple choice had begun lifting a weight she had believed no one could understand. The church caretaker slowly approached from the entrance carrying a cardboard box filled with abandoned wedding programs. His shoulders sagged with visible sympathy. Miss Harper, he said gently, we have packed your decorations inside the fellowship hall whenever you feel ready. Emily offered a grateful nod. Thank you. I will come inside in a few minutes. The caretaker hesitated before looking toward Marcus. Sir, thank you for helping us earlier. Marcus smiled politely. You are welcome. As the caretaker disappeared back through the chapel doors, Emily quietly shook her head. Everyone seems to know you after only a few minutes. Marcus gave a small laugh. Not really. I just try to leave places a little lighter than I found them. Emily repeated the sentence silently. Leave places a little lighter. She wondered how different the world might feel if more people lived that way. Nearby, Olivia spotted several flower girls struggling to carry baskets filled with loose rose petals back toward their parents. Without waiting to be asked, she hurried over and helped gather the petals that had spilled across the sidewalk. The younger children smiled gratefully, and within seconds they were laughing together as though the sadness surrounding the church belonged to another world. Emily watched the scene with moist eyes. She notices people exactly the way you do, she whispered. Marcus followed Olivia with quiet pride. Children usually become what they see much more than what they hear. Emily slowly turned toward him. You have given her something very few parents ever manage to give. Marcus looked surprised. What is that? Security, Emily answered. Not because life is easy. Because she believes someone will always be there when it is hard. Marcus remained silent for a moment before answering. I cannot protect her from every disappointment, but I can make sure she never faces one believing she is alone. Emily felt those words settle deep inside her heart. Only an hour earlier she had stood in front of hundreds of guests feeling completely abandoned. Standing beside this quiet father and his daughter, she experienced something she had not expected to find on the worst day of her life. Safety. Not because her circumstances had changed. They had not. The wedding was still over before it began. The future she planned was still gone. But the crushing loneliness had begun to loosen its grip. A church bell echoed softly across the nearly empty street, marking another passing hour. Marcus glanced toward the sky before looking back at Emily. We should probably let you be with your family. Emily instinctively tightened her fingers around the bakery box. Before you go, she said quietly, may I ask you one more question? Marcus nodded with the same patient expression he had carried since returning to the church. Emily took a slow breath, knowing the answer mattered far more than she could explain. What made you turn your truck around after you had already driven away? Emily's question lingered gently in the quiet afternoon air. For several seconds, Marcus did not answer. He looked toward the old maple trees lining the church parking lot, their leaves moving softly beneath the breeze, as though searching for the right memory rather than the right words. Olivia quietly slipped her hand into his again, sensing that her father had traveled somewhere far beyond the church steps. Emily noticed the change in his expression. It was not sadness alone. It was remembrance. Finally, Marcus smiled, though it was the kind of smile that carried both gratitude and loss. Because someone once turned around for me, he said quietly. Emily remained silent, allowing him to continue only if he wished. Marcus looked down at Olivia before speaking again. The day my wife passed away, I thought I had reached the end of everything that mattered. I drove home from the hospital with Olivia asleep in the back seat. She was too young to understand why her mother was not coming home with us. His voice never trembled. It remained calm, steady, almost gentle. That somehow made every word feel heavier. I stopped at a gas station because I realized I had forgotten to buy milk. It sounds ridiculous now, but grief does strange things. I stood there staring at the refrigerator, unable to remember why I had walked inside. Emily listened without moving. Marcus continued. A woman who worked behind the counter noticed I had been standing there for several minutes. She did not ask questions. She simply walked over, handed me a bottle of water, and said, "Take your time. There is no rush today." He smiled faintly at the memory. When I finally walked back outside, she followed me with 2 small chocolate chip cookies wrapped in a paper bag. Emily's eyes softened. "For Olivia?" Marcus nodded. She looked through the truck window and saw a little girl sleeping with tear stains still on her face. She said children should never wake up believing the whole world has become dark. The church grounds fell completely silent around them. Even the workers seemed distant now. I offered to pay, Marcus continued. She refused. Then she said something I have never forgotten. Emily barely whispered. What did she say? Marcus looked directly at her. One day you will recognize someone carrying the same weight you once carried. When that day comes, do not keep walking. When that day comes, do not walk past them. Emily slowly lowered her eyes. Suddenly everything made sense. The cupcakes, the patience, the silence, the decision to return after already driving away. None of it had been spontaneous. It had been a promise kept years after it was first made. Marcus shrugged almost apologetically. I never learned her last name. I never saw her again. But she changed the way I wanted to live. Emily felt tears gather again, though they were different now. They no longer came only from heartbreak. They came from realizing that kindness could travel across years through complete strangers who would never meet each other. Olivia looked up at Emily with her usual innocent smile. Daddy says good things keep going if people do not stop them. Emily knelt until she was at Olivia's height. Your daddy is very wise. Olivia giggled. He says he is still learning. Emily laughed softly through her tears, the sound quiet but genuine. She stood again and looked at Marcus with a gratitude too deep for ordinary words. Then I think that woman would be proud of you. Marcus glanced once more toward the empty church before answering. I hope she would be proud of anyone who decides to stay when leaving would be easier. Emily looked around at the nearly deserted chapel, then back at the father standing before her. At that moment, she realized the worst day of her life had also become the day a stranger quietly restored something she thought she had lost forever. Not her wedding, not her future, her faith that goodness still existed in ordinary people. Emily stood quietly for several long moments after Marcus finished speaking. She looked down at the cupcake box resting against her bouquet and imagined a woman she would never meet, standing behind the counter of an ordinary gas station years ago, offering kindness to a grieving father she did not know. One small decision had crossed years, touched countless strangers, and somehow found its way to the church steps on the worst afternoon of Emily's life. The realization settled deeply inside her. Perhaps compassion never truly ended. Perhaps it simply moved from one person to another until someone chose to stop passing it forward. She looked back at Marcus with renewed respect. She never knew what became of you, Emily said softly. Marcus shook his head. Probably not. Then she never knew what she started. Marcus smiled gently. Maybe she did not need to. Emily let those words sink in. She had spent months planning a wedding where every detail would be remembered. Yet the moment that would remain with her forever had not been planned at all. It had arrived in the form of a father carrying cupcakes and a little girl carrying hope. Olivia suddenly tugged lightly on Marcus's sleeve. Daddy, she whispered, is Miss Emily going to be okay? Marcus looked at his daughter before answering carefully. I think she will. Maybe not today, but one day. Emily heard every word. Instead of feeling pitied, she felt understood. Marcus had not promised that tomorrow would erase today's pain. He had only reminded her that pain was never the end of the story unless a person decided to stop walking. The chapel doors opened once more as Emily's older brother stepped outside searching for her. He slowed when he saw Marcus and Olivia still standing beside her. There was a question in his eyes, but after noticing the calm expression on his sister's face, he chose not to interrupt. Emily turned toward him with the first steady breath she had taken all afternoon. "I will be inside in just a minute," she said. He nodded quietly and returned to the church without asking another question. Marcus glanced toward his truck. The daylight was beginning to fade, and Olivia still had homework waiting at home. He looked back at Emily. "We should let your family be with you now." Emily nodded, though she found herself unexpectedly reluctant to see them leave. "I understand." She carefully shifted the bouquet into one arm before extending her free hand toward Marcus. "Thank you. Not for fixing today, because nobody could have done that." Her voice grew softer. "Thank you for making sure today was not only about what I lost." Marcus accepted her hand with quiet warmth. "Take one day at a time." Emily smiled faintly. "I think I finally can." Olivia stepped forward before Marcus could open the truck door. She wrapped her small arms gently around Emily's waist in a brief, innocent hug. Emily closed her eyes for just a second, returning the embrace with unexpected tenderness. When Olivia stepped back, she looked up with complete confidence. "Your next happy day is still looking for you." Emily laughed softly through fresh tears. "I hope you are right." "I know I am," Olivia replied. Marcus smiled at his daughter's certainty before helping her climb into the truck. As the engine started, Emily remained standing on the church steps, one hand holding the bouquet that represented the future she had lost, the other holding the little bakery box that represented the hope she had unexpectedly found. She watched the old pickup disappear slowly beneath the oak trees until it was no longer visible. Only then did she turn back toward the chapel. The pain had not disappeared. The unanswered questions still remained. But somewhere between a stranger's quiet presence and a child's simple kindness, the unbearable loneliness had become something she no longer had to carry completely by herself. And without realizing it, she turned toward the chapel carrying the same bouquet, the same cupcake box, and the same unanswered questions. Yet none of them felt quite as heavy anymore. Sometimes the people who save a broken day are not the ones who promise to change your future. They are simply the ones who refuse to let you face today alone. The courtroom remained unusually quiet after the final document had been admitted into evidence. No one seemed willing to speak first, because every confident assumption from earlier that day had begun to dissolve beneath the weight of undeniable facts. The silence was no longer protecting authority. It was protecting fear. The officer who had once carried himself with effortless confidence now avoided looking toward the woman he had dismissed only hours before. His shoulders remained squared, but the certainty behind them had disappeared. Every passing second seemed heavier than the last. She did not celebrate. She did not smile. Instead, she calmly organized another folder and placed it on the polished table with the same steady hands that had remained composed through every insult, every whisper, and every attempt to diminish her presence. Imagine standing there after being judged before anyone cared enough to ask the truth. Imagine watching the same people who refused to hear your voice suddenly hanging on every quiet word you chose to speak. That was the difference between power borrowed from a badge and authority earned through integrity. The judge slowly adjusted his glasses before carefully reviewing the latest exhibits. The room could almost hear the gentle turning of each page. Internal memoranda, archive complaints, witness statements that had never reached a courtroom, signed acknowledgments from supervisors who had promised investigations that quietly disappeared. None of them looked dramatic on paper. Together, they painted a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Several members of the audience exchanged uneasy glances. Earlier, they had followed the confidence of the uniform. Now they found themselves questioning how many other people had walked into that same building carrying truth that never received the chance to speak. The realization settled over the gallery like a slow-moving storm. One older woman quietly reached for the hand of her grandson sitting beside her. She did not say a word. She simply squeezed his hand a little tighter, as if silently promising that justice was still worth believing in. The woman at the center of the case finally stepped forward again. Her voice never rose above a calm, professional tone. She explained that this investigation had never been about humiliating one officer. It had always been about restoring public trust before another family lost faith in the very institutions created to protect them. That single sentence changed the emotional weight inside the courtroom. Even those who had doubted her began to understand that accountability was not revenge. It was responsibility. The lead prosecutor slowly lowered. His eyes toward the evidence spread across his desk. For the first time that day, he appeared less interested in defending old assumptions than in understanding how deeply the failures extended. Behind him, several officials quietly exchanged brief conversations, already realizing that difficult decisions would soon have to be made beyond this courtroom. Careers might change. Policies might change. Training might change. But none of those changes would matter unless people first admitted that the truth had been ignored. Outside the courthouse, reporters continued gathering as word spread that the hearing had taken an unexpected direction. Cameras waited. Microphones stood ready. Yet inside the courtroom, no one rushed toward the spotlight. The most important victory was unfolding far away from television headlines. It was happening inside the minds of ordinary people who had witnessed dignity refuse to surrender under pressure. The officer finally lifted his eyes toward her. He seemed ready to speak, then stopped. Whatever explanation he had prepared no longer carried the certainty it once did. She met his gaze without anger and without satisfaction. There was only quiet resolve. Some lessons arrived through punishment. Others arrived through truth that refused to disappear. As the judge announced a brief recess before the final proceedings continued, no one hurried toward the exit. They remained seated, almost afraid to disturb the fragile moment. Because everyone in that room understood something they had overlooked for far too long. Respect should never depend on appearance, and justice loses its meaning the moment people decide who deserves to be heard before the first word is ever spoken. The courtroom felt different when everyone returned from the recess. The tension had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something quieter and far more meaningful. No one expected another dramatic revelation. The truth had already spoken for itself. Now the only question that remained was whether the institution built to protect justice would prove worthy of its own name. The judge settled into his chair with a noticeably different expression than the one he had carried earlier that morning. His voice was slower, more deliberate, every word chosen with the care that should have guided the hearing from the very beginning. He acknowledged that the evidence presented revealed serious failures that extended beyond one misunderstanding or one individual decision. The record reflected patterns that demanded accountability, transparency, and immediate review. Every sentence echoed across the silent courtroom, not as punishment, but as recognition that justice begins with admitting when justice has fallen short. The woman listened without triumph. Her hands rested calmly on the table, while the light from the courtroom windows stretched across the polished wood. She had never entered this building hoping to embarrass anyone. She had entered carrying the burden of proving what too many others had struggled to prove before her. Imagine carrying that responsibility while knowing every mistake could erase years of careful work. Imagine remaining calm while others questioned your integrity simply because they believed appearances were stronger than facts. That quiet strength was what carried her through every moment leading to this day. The officer remained standing beside his attorney, his face reflecting a mixture of regret and disbelief. For the first time, he seemed to understand that respect could never be demanded through authority alone. It had to be earned every single day through fairness, restraint, and humility. The courtroom no longer saw him as the confident figure who had entered wearing a uniform that morning. They saw another human being confronted by the consequences of choices that could no longer be explained away. Across the gallery, several reporters lowered their notebooks for a brief moment. Even they sensed that the most important story was no longer about scandal. It was about transformation. One young law student quietly wiped away a tear before writing a single sentence across the top of her legal pad. Justice listens before it judges. She knew she would remember those words long after the headlines faded. The judge announced that an independent review board would examine every complaint connected to the evidence introduced during the hearing. Additional witnesses would be contacted. Archived cases would receive renewed evaluation. Every recommendation would become part of the public record. The announcement did not erase the pain experienced by those who had waited years to be heard, but it opened a door that had remained locked for far too long. As the hearing officially concluded, people slowly rose from their seats. No applause filled the courtroom. No celebration interrupted the dignity of the moment. Instead, there was respectful silence. the kind of silence that follows when people recognize they have witnessed something larger than a single legal proceeding. The woman gathered her folders one final time. Before reaching the exit, she paused beside a young courthouse employee who had quietly watched the entire hearing. The employee thanked her for refusing to give up. She smiled gently and answered with words that carried more weight than any verdict delivered that afternoon. Truth does not become stronger because people believe it. Truth remains strong because it refuses to become something else. Outside, the afternoon sun finally broke through the clouds that had covered the courthouse since morning. Warm light reflected across the wide stone steps as families, attorneys, reporters, and ordinary citizens stepped into the fresh air together. Some conversations were hopeful, others remained thoughtful, but every person carried something different than they had brought into the building. They carried the reminder that dignity cannot be measured by appearance, authority cannot replace character, and real justice begins the moment people find the courage to see one another as equals before the law and before humanity. 3 weeks passed before the courthouse welcomed another morning that felt noticeably different. The marble halls were unchanged. The wooden benches still carried the marks of countless hearings, and the old clock above the entrance continued its steady rhythm. Yet something invisible had shifted inside the building. Conversations were quieter, greetings more sincere, and every officer walking through the security checkpoint seemed more aware that every decision, no matter how small, carried lasting consequences. The independent review board had worked without interruption, examining records that had remained untouched for years. File after file revealed moments when assumptions had replaced evidence, when hurried conclusions had overshadowed careful investigation, and when ordinary citizens had walked away believing their voices no longer mattered. Some complaints had been based on misunderstandings. Others revealed procedural failures that demanded immediate correction. The purpose was never to rewrite history. It was to prevent history from quietly repeating itself. The woman returned to the courthouse that morning wearing the same calm expression that had carried her through every difficult moment before. She walked through the entrance without seeking attention. Several employees recognized her immediately, but instead of whispers there were respectful nods. Respect earned through truth felt different from respect demanded by authority. It required no announcement because everyone could feel it. Imagine walking into the same place where people once doubted your presence, only to discover that your greatest victory was not changing their opinion of you, but changing the way they treated the next person who walked through those doors. That was the kind of victory no headline could fully capture. Inside a conference room overlooking the courthouse lawn, judges, investigators, community representatives, and law enforcement supervisors gathered around a long oak table. The atmosphere remained professional, yet hopeful. They reviewed recommendations that focused on transparency, improved communication, additional training, and stronger oversight. Every proposal shared one common purpose: restore confidence by ensuring every individual received the same fairness regardless of appearance, background, or social status. The officer whose decisions had started the investigation also attended the meeting. He no longer wore the confidence that once came from believing his position alone protected him. Instead, he listened carefully as community members described experiences that statistics could never fully explain. Parents spoke about teaching their children how to remain calm during difficult encounters. Veterans described serving their country while still questioning whether strangers would see their sacrifice before noticing the color of their skin. Teachers explained how trust in public institutions began forming long before adulthood. None of the speakers raised their voices. They did not need to. Honest experiences often carried greater weight than anger ever could. The officer slowly stood and acknowledged that he had allowed assumptions to influence professional judgment. He admitted that listening after mistakes could never erase the impact of those mistakes, but refusing to listen would guarantee that nothing improved. His words did not instantly rebuild trust. Trust never returned that quickly, yet they marked the beginning of accountability instead of denial. The woman listened quietly before offering only one observation. She reminded everyone that justice was strongest when people had the courage to examine themselves with the same honesty they expected from others. The room remained silent for several seconds because no one could argue with that truth. Outside, the courthouse steps welcomed families arriving for unrelated hearings, attorneys preparing new cases, and ordinary citizens hoping for fair treatment. None of them knew every detail of the investigation that had unfolded during the previous weeks. They simply entered expecting the law to serve everyone equally. That expectation was both fragile and powerful. It depended entirely on the character of the people entrusted to protect it. As the meeting concluded, sunlight poured through the tall windows, filling the conference room with warm afternoon light. The woman gathered her documents one final time before walking toward the exit. She paused only briefly to look across the courthouse lobby where strangers greeted one another with quiet courtesy. The building itself had not changed. The people inside had begun to change. Sometimes the greatest measure of justice was not found in a verdict or an apology. Sometimes it appeared when the next person walked through the same door and was welcomed with dignity from the very first moment. Nearly 2 months after the hearing, the courthouse had become the quiet center of a conversation that reached far beyond its stone walls. Community meetings filled libraries, churches, schools, and civic centers across the county. People who had rarely spoken to one another before now found themselves sitting around the same tables, sharing stories that had remained unspoken for years. Some spoke with confidence. Others hesitated before finding the courage to continue. Every voice added another piece to a larger picture that could no longer be ignored. The woman attended several of those meetings, never introducing herself by title or position unless someone specifically asked. She preferred to listen first. She understood that lasting change rarely began with speeches. It began when people believed someone was finally willing to hear them without interruption. Parents described teaching their children to remain respectful while also believing their dignity mattered. Retired officers reflected on mentors who had taught them that authority existed to serve the public rather than command it. Young students asked questions that many adults had quietly avoided for decades. Why do people judge someone before learning their story? Why does trust take years to build, but only moments to lose? No one offered easy answers because easy answers had never solved difficult problems. Imagine sitting in a room where complete strangers discovered they carried the same fears, the same hopes, and the same desire to leave something better behind for the next generation. That realization was stronger than any headline. It reminded everyone that communities became stronger when people chose conversation instead of assumption. One afternoon, the woman returned to the courthouse for a scheduled policy review. The atmosphere inside felt familiar, yet unmistakably different from the first day she had entered those doors. Security officers greeted every visitor with the same professional courtesy. Staff members patiently explained procedures instead of rushing anxious families through long lines. Small gestures that once seemed insignificant now carried enormous meaning because they reflected a deeper commitment to fairness. During the meeting, updated training standards were presented to judges, supervisors, and department leaders. The new approach emphasized careful observation, respectful communication, unbiased decision-making, and accountability at every level of responsibility. Experienced instructors reminded the audience that professionalism was measured most clearly during difficult moments rather than comfortable ones. Every participant understood that written policies alone could never transform an institution. Character had to bring those policies to life every single day. The former officer also attended as an observer. He spoke very little, choosing instead to take notes while others discussed practical improvements. At the conclusion of the session, he quietly approached the woman. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, he thanked her for refusing to answer disrespect with bitterness. He admitted that watching the investigation unfold had forced him to confront assumptions he had never questioned before. She accepted his words with calm sincerity and reminded him that meaningful change was not measured by one conversation. It was measured by every decision made afterward when no one was watching. He nodded slowly, understanding that redemption was not an event. It was a lifelong commitment. As they walked toward the courthouse entrance, afternoon sunlight reflected across the wide marble floor. Families waited patiently for scheduled hearings. Young attorneys carried stacks of files toward nearby courtrooms. A little girl looked up at the American flag standing beside the entrance before smiling at her mother and continuing inside without fear. The woman noticed that simple moment and quietly smiled to herself. Sometimes hope appeared in ordinary scenes that most people hurried past without noticing. Before leaving, She paused outside the courthouse and looked back one final time. The building still represented the weight of law, responsibility, and public trust. But now it also represented something else. It reminded her that justice was never finished. Each new day offered another opportunity to choose fairness over prejudice, patience over assumption, and truth over convenience. Those choices, repeated often enough, could reshape not only institutions but the hearts of the people entrusted to protect them. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the courthouse square with shades of amber and gold as cool morning air replaced the heavy warmth of summer. The fountain at the center of the plaza reflected the early sunlight, while people crossed the brick pathways carrying briefcases, coffee cups, and hopes that their day would be treated with fairness. Life had returned to its familiar rhythm, yet those who worked inside the courthouse understood that familiar did not mean unchanged. Every hallway carried a stronger sense of purpose because the lessons learned months earlier had become part of the institution itself. The woman had gradually returned to her regular responsibilities, traveling between agencies, reviewing investigations, and advising departments committed to strengthening public confidence. She never sought recognition for the changes that followed. Whenever colleagues praised her determination, she quietly redirected the conversation toward the many individuals who had found the courage to tell their stories. She believed lasting progress never belonged to one person. It belonged to everyone willing to protect the truth, even when doing so required patience, sacrifice, and resilience. Imagine planting a single seed without knowing whether it would ever grow. Months later, you return and discover not one tree, but an entire garden taking root because others decided to continue caring for what you first believed was only a small beginning. That was how meaningful change often happened. It spread quietly through ordinary people making better choices one decision at a time. One crisp Thursday morning, the courthouse welcomed a new group of recently hired officers, clerks, and legal interns attending orientation. Among them were young men and women from different backgrounds, each carrying their own expectations about public service. During the final session, they watched a presentation about professionalism, impartiality, and community trust. Real case studies replaced abstract theories. Respectful communication replaced outdated assumptions. Experienced instructors reminded every new employee that every conversation with a citizen could strengthen confidence in justice or slowly weaken it. The choice belonged to them every single day. As the presentation concluded, the chief administrator invited the woman to share a few closing thoughts. She walked to the front of the room without notes or prepared remarks. The audience immediately became still. She looked across the room at faces filled with ambition, uncertainty, and possibility before speaking in the same calm voice that had carried her through every challenge. She explained that uniforms, titles, and positions could open doors, but character determined what happened after those doors opened. Every person who entered the courthouse deserved to feel seen before being judged, heard before being questioned, and respected before any conclusion was reached. Fairness, she reminded them, was not an extraordinary act. It was a daily habit built through thousands of ordinary decisions. The room remained completely silent. Several recruits slowly nodded while writing down her words. One young deputy later admitted that he had entered public service believing courage meant acting quickly. That morning, he realized courage also meant slowing down long enough to understand another person's story before making assumptions. Across the room, senior officials exchanged quiet glances of approval. They recognized that the strongest lessons rarely came from policy manuals. They came from lived experience honestly shared. After the orientation ended, the recruits walked through the courthouse together before beginning their assignments. They greeted visitors with genuine courtesy, patiently answered questions, and offered directions to families who looked uncertain about where to go. Small moments unfolded throughout the building, almost unnoticed by those passing through, yet each one reflected the values discussed only minutes earlier. Standing near the courthouse entrance, the woman watched those interactions for a brief moment. Before stepping outside into the cool afternoon breeze, leaves drifted gently across the stone steps while the American flag moved steadily above the entrance. She smiled quietly, not because every problem had disappeared, but because she could finally see evidence that tomorrow might be better than yesterday. Justice had never depended on perfection. It depended on ordinary people choosing integrity again and again until fairness became stronger than prejudice and compassion became stronger than fear. The first snow of the season arrived before sunrise, covering the courthouse lawn with a thin blanket of white that softened every path leading to the front steps. The city awakened slowly beneath the quiet light of morning, and the courthouse stood exactly where it always had, strong and familiar, yet forever changed by the people who had chosen courage over comfort. Inside, the halls echoed with ordinary conversations, the turning of pages, the careful footsteps of attorneys preparing for hearings, and the gentle greetings exchanged between employees and visitors. Nothing appeared extraordinary to someone walking through the building for the first time. That was perhaps the greatest sign that justice had begun healing. Respect had become part of the routine instead of an exception. The woman paused near the large window overlooking the square before preparing to leave for another assignment. She watched families crossing the sidewalk together, children laughing as they hurried through the cold, and elderly neighbors helping one another climb the courthouse steps. Those simple moments reminded her why every difficult day had mattered. The investigation had never been about proving one person wrong. It had always been about protecting countless people she would never meet. Imagine standing at the end of a journey only to realize the destination was never your own victory. Imagine discovering that the greatest reward was knowing strangers would now walk a little taller because someone refused to remain silent when silence was easier. That realization settled quietly in her heart as she gathered her coat and documents. Before reaching the exit, she noticed a young deputy greeting an anxious elderly couple with patience and kindness. He carefully explained each step of the check-in process, answered every question without rushing, and wished them well before they continued toward their hearing. The exchange lasted less than 2 minutes, yet it reflected everything that had been fought for during the months before. Fairness had become visible in the smallest actions. Nearby, another courthouse employee smiled warmly while helping a confused visitor find the correct courtroom. No cameras recorded those moments. No newspaper would print their names. Yet those quiet choices carried more influence than any headline because they restored trust one conversation at a time. As she stepped outside, the cold air carried the peaceful stillness that often follows fresh snowfall. She turned once more toward the courthouse entrance where the American flag moved gently above the stone columns. She understood that prejudice had not disappeared from the world. Human imperfection never vanished completely. But she also knew something equally important. Every generation had the opportunity to choose something better than the one before it. Every act of fairness weakened injustice. Every decision to listen before judging strengthened the foundation of true justice. The former officer emerged from the building a few moments later. Their eyes met briefly across the snow-covered walkway. Neither of them spoke. No words were necessary. The past could never be rewritten, but the future remained unwritten for everyone willing to learn from it. They exchanged a quiet nod before walking in different directions, each carrying lessons that would shape every choice still to come. As the morning sun slowly broke through the winter clouds, its light reflected across the courthouse windows, transforming cold glass into warm gold. It was a simple reminder that even after the longest shadow, light always finds a way back. He once believed authority gave him the right to define justice. She understood that true justice never belongs to one person. It belongs to every heart brave enough to choose dignity, truth, and compassion when it matters most. And perhaps, that is how real karma arrives. Not through anger, not through revenge, but through the quiet moment when truth finally stands where fear once stood and no one can look away again. Every story leaves us with a question. What would you have done if you were in their place? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If you enjoy touching stories, inspiring life journeys, emotional family dramas, and unforgettable love stories, don't forget to like, subscribe to Hidden Father Stories, and turn on notifications. A brand new cinematic story is waiting for you tomorrow.